Hello, my name is Callie. This happened just last month in July. I was in San Diego for a softball tournament and had rented a trailer to stay in with some of my friends. We would ride our scooters back and forth to each other's trailers. Keep that in mind for some context. On the second day of the tournament, I went back to my trailer to shower after my game. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud bang on the right side of the wall, which faced the outside of the trailer. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my brother playing around. As I got out of the shower, I got a text from one of my friends asking me to ride my scooter over to their trailer and bring a wiffle ball bat so we could play. I grabbed everything and started riding over. While I was riding, I heard a cough, almost like a smoker's cough, coming from the bushes. Startled, I stopped and stared at the bush. A dirty, middle-aged man rose from the bush, smirking at me in a really unsettling, creepy way. Without hesitating, I sped away on my scooter and didn't look back. I finally made it to my friend's trailer and we started playing wiffle ball. At one point, I was up to bat and hit a foul ball into the bushes. We searched for the ball for about an hour, but couldn't find it and eventually gave up. Just as we were turning to leave, the ball rolled right up to my ankle. I turned around and saw the same man I had seen earlier. We all screamed, ran inside the trailer, and told the adults. Unfortunately, they didn't believe us and thought we were playing a prank. Later, my family and I went back to our trailer, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Exhausted, I eventually fell asleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up for no apparent reason and tried to get back to sleep. Before I continue, I need to explain that near the head of my bed, there's a tiny window with small curtains. I noticed a little light outside and moved the curtains to look out. What I saw next horrified me. The man from the bushes was standing outside, shining a flashlight near my window. I'm pretty sure he saw me, because the moment I looked, he sprinted to the window, pressed his face against the glass, and started pounding on it. He was making weird noises and chanting. One thing he said still gives me chills to this day. He looked me in the eyes and started yelling.
"He will get you. He knows where you are, and you can't hide from him."
Over and over again. I screamed as loudly as I could, waking my parents and alerting the park rangers. My parents rushed into the room, and the park rangers tackled the man outside. We called the police, who arrested him. It turned out he was a child predator who had been stalking me the entire time we were staying in the trailer park. To this day, I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't woken up in time. My name is Bianca, and I live in Kenya. I'm 15 years old, but this story happened 2 years ago. It's something I'll never forget. My family decided to take a trip to the coast in Mombasa. I was with some of my cousins and siblings, and after about a week, we decided to visit the beach. We stayed until sunset, and then our parents told my oldest cousin to drive us home at 9 p.m. while they went to a club nearby. Everyone was doing their own thing at the beach. I was with my cousin, let's call her Jane. Jane was my favorite cousin, and we got along like best friends. As we walked along the sand, I noticed something on the ground. It was 1,000 shillings, a lot of money in Kenya. Excited, I picked it up. Jane and I decided to keep the money a secret, not telling our siblings because we knew they'd borrow it. We couldn't stop talking about what we'd spend it on. At 9 p.m., my cousin drove us home. The place we were staying in had 6 bedrooms, and I shared one with Jane and some other female cousins. Jane and I shared a bed. That night, we stayed up watching YouTube videos before falling asleep. I woke up suddenly at 4 a.m. I thought I heard someone talking, so I assumed my cousins were still awake. I tried to get up to go to the kitchen for water, but I couldn't move. My legs and arms felt paralyzed. I tried calling out to Jane, but no words would come out. Panic set in. My eyes darted around the room, and that's when I saw it. Near the door stood a dark figure of a man. He was tall, about 6'5", and wore a long coat. My heart raced because I knew no one in my family owned such a coat. The figure started floating, and I broke out in a cold sweat. Then it spoke in a low, chilling voice.
Return me to where you found me.
I was frozen with fear, not understanding what he meant. Suddenly, I felt a pair of hands shaking me, and I woke up gasping. It was Jane. She said I was breathing heavily and sweating. When she asked me what was wrong, I told her it was just a bad dream. I stayed awake watching TikToks until sunrise, trying to shake the feeling. The next day, we went to a museum. I managed to forget about the dream for a while. Jane and I spent the money we found, and everything seemed normal. But that night, it happened again. I woke up to Jane shaking me, asking if I was okay. This time I told her about the dream. She hugged me and tried to comfort me, but I couldn't sleep. The cycle repeated for several nights. Jane grew worried and told my parents about the reoccurring nightmare. My parents decided to take me to a priest for prayers. Afterward, I started sleeping better, and the trip eventually ended. Back home, I was sad to be away from Jane. That night, I went to bed thinking everything would be fine now, but the dream came back, only this time, it was worse. The man was closer to me. I could feel his presence looming over me. Trembling, I asked him why he was tormenting me. His reply made my blood run cold.
Return me to where you found me.
Finally, I understood. He was talking about the money. My heart sank. I'd already spent it. Panicked, I told him the truth. The man began to mumble strange words, and before I could react, he entered my body. A searing pain ripped through me, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My mother sat beside me, looking terrified. She told me she'd heard screaming and rushed to my room, only to find me banging my head against the wall repeatedly until I collapsed, bleeding. I told her everything, the dreams, the man, the money. She took me to therapy, and over time, I started to recover. Since then, I haven't had the dream again, but I've never forgotten the man's words or the lesson he taught me. Some things are better left where you find them.
My name is Sanjana, and this is a true story that happened to me. This incident occurred when I was around 8 years old. We were having a lunch party at my house, and my friends and I were playing in the front yard. One of my friends' dads was supervising us. After a few minutes, a police car pulled up to our house, and an officer asked if we had seen a tall man dressed in all black walking around the neighborhood. We were confused and a little scared. My friend's dad responded, "No, we haven't seen anyone," and the police continued their search. Feeling frightened, we decided to go inside. My house had a street in the backyard, so everyone else left through the back to go home. My family and I stayed inside and looked out the window to see if we could spot the man. After a while, we saw him. He was creeping out from behind the bushes of the house across from us. My dad started taking pictures through the window and sent them to our friends who lived 5 blocks down, where the police were investigating. They showed the police the pictures, and the officers began searching near the area across the street. Meanwhile, I, being a naive 8-year-old, decided to open the door to get a better look at the man. He was covering his face with a hat, so I assumed he couldn't see me if I couldn't see him. My heart raced, and I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, he began sprinting. As he ran, I saw him reaching into his pocket as if to pull something out. I thought it might be a weapon, and I stood there, frozen in fear. Just as he was about to reach the steps in front of my house, my parents noticed me standing at the door. They pulled me inside right in the nick of time. The police found him shortly after and arrested him. To this day, I'm still traumatized by that event. I often wonder what might have happened to me if my parents hadn't acted so quickly and pulled me inside.
Hi, my name is Anna. I've been watching your videos and I really enjoy them. I want to share a story of my own, something that happened a long time ago. This incident is what sparked my interest in ghosts and the supernatural. It was years ago, back when I was in elementary school. My older sister, my mom, and I went to visit my grandparents' house. Many of my uncles, aunts, and cousins were already there, so we had to sleep upstairs. This story takes place in what we called the Blue Room, where my mom and I slept. We called it the Blue Room because literally everything in the room was blue. The curtains, the walls, the bed sheets, you name it. One night, for some reason, I woke up at 5 in the morning. The room felt freezing cold, like there was some kind of presence nearby. I looked over at my mom, who was sleeping beside me on my left. What I saw still confuses me to this day. There was this little light floating above her head, just inches away from her face. It was a small, white light. At first, I thought it was just flickering, but I quickly realized it wasn't. It was actually spinning in circles around her head, moving so fast it almost looked like it was flickering. Being a little kid, I was curious, and I wanted to reach out and touch it, but something inside me stopped me. It was like a voice in my head was telling me, "Stay where you are." That's when my mom let out a little groan and finally opened her eyes. As soon as she did, the light stopped moving. It froze just inches from her face. My mom looked scared and confused, and we just lay there, staring at this still, glowing light until it suddenly vanished. She turned to me, her face filled with panic, and asked, "Did you see the light just now?" I replied, "You mean the one in front of your face just now?" My mom jumped out of bed, panicked, and ran to turn the bathroom light on. We ended up sitting there with the lights on until morning. We couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. At first, we thought it might have been a firefly, but the light didn't look or move like a firefly at all. When we told the rest of the family what happened, they were not surprised. They told us there had always been strange things happening in the Blue Room. Doors shutting on their own, lights turning on and off by themselves, all kinds of weird stuff. That's when they mentioned something that gave us chills. Apparently, there was a family who used to live in the house before my grandparents moved in. They had a little boy who sadly died of a fever in the house. Years later, my mom told me her side of the story. She said that while she was sleeping, she thought it was already morning because of how bright the light was through her eyelids. But when she opened her eyes, she saw the little light floating just inches from her face. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but then she turned and saw me staring at her. That's when she realized it was real. I'm 18 years old now, but I still wonder what would have happened if I had reached out and touched that light. One thing is for sure, we never slept in the Blue Room again. I don't know where to start. This incident is still ongoing. I think it was about 3 years ago when I started having this horrible dream. The dream was always similar. I was on a swing at a playground with a man, even though we are both adults. The man spoke a strange language. It didn't seem like an earthly language, but strangely enough, in my dream, I understood what he was trying to say. He said his name was H. Then the sunset quickly faded and night fell. Then he ran away in fear. When night fell, it became so dark that I couldn't see anything. The dream is so vivid, and when I look up at the sky, I can't see any stars or the moon. There was only darkness. You probably don't know what this kind of complete darkness is. I experienced it for the first time in this dream. It was truly a deep darkness. Then a disgusting smell started to come out, and I started hearing the growling sounds of unknown beings in the distance. The beings come towards me, emitting a red light, and then I hear the voice of that man named H shouting at me from afar.
Wake up!
The voice was so desperate and creepy. And then I woke up from the dream, and when I look at the time, it's 4 or 5 in the morning. The dream always had the same pattern. I was so confused and couldn't figure out what the hell this dream was. No matter how much I searched on Google or asked people, I couldn't figure out anything. Then one day, I had that dream again. I was on a swing at the playground with H, but this time he was frowning, and he said to me,
Do you know where this is? Please don't come here.
When I asked why, he said,
This is where the soul predators exist.
I asked him what that meant, but he just looked up at the sky and ran away without saying a word. And then night came again, and I heard the cries of the strange creatures and the creepy footsteps approaching. The footsteps sounded like thousands of feet walking. Out of curiosity, this time I decided to wait without waking up from the dream. And then I heard them whispering, getting closer, but their language was still strange, and I couldn't understand what they were saying. At that moment, I was gripped by a terrible fear, and I thought I had to wake up from the dream. Then I saw the strange creatures and heard what they were saying clearly, and I opened my eyes and woke up on the bed in my room. I immediately recorded the words the strange creatures said in my dream right on my phone. It sounded like this. Sobri rock, sobri rock, sobri rock, sobri rock. But I couldn't understand what it meant, and it didn't seem like an earth language. I was gripped by fear, and I couldn't fall asleep again. After a while, I had a dream again, and that day, I had a really fun conversation with H in my dream. I don't remember the content of the conversation, but it was a really happy moment. And then, at some point, night came, and when the monsters approached, H screamed and tried to run away, but it was too late. The giant monsters were already in front of us, and they looked like giant centipedes. The giant centipedes ate H. The sound of H's entire body being torn apart, the sound of the centipedes chewing him up, and the vivid red color of his blood. All of that was more real than reality. I screamed like crazy, but my voice didn't come out because it was a dream. I felt pain as if my head was going to burst because I was trying so hard to scream. After a while, after the giant centipedes ate H, one of them came to me and bit my arm. It was so painful. And then I was trying to wake up from the dream. Fortunately, I opened my eyes in my bed, but what was horrible was I felt a pain in my arm. I went to the hospital, and the doctor said that my arm was very inflamed, and that if I had been a little late, it would have rotted away. Thankfully, I received treatment and recovered. But what's scarier is I keep having that dream, even now. Now, in that dream, I'm riding the swing by myself, without H, but I feel an inexplicable happiness in the playground, and ironically, that happiness makes me not want to wake up from the dream. Thankfully, I've learned how to wake up from the dream now, so I wake up before those giant centipedes appear. But I still don't know what that dream means or why I'm always in that playground, and what would happen to me if I were to be eaten by those centipedes.
To tell you a little about the setting of my story, my family lives across from a police station in a small village. Everything is very close to us. Just 3 doors down from our house is a shop. Friday, July 14th, 2023. I was sitting in the living room. My mom was watching TV, my granny was on the phone, and I was on my iPad when my mom suddenly sprung up from her seat and looked out the front window because she heard a noise. I shrugged it off, not thinking much about it. She said there were 2 men, one who looked to be in his 40s and the other in his 30s, running up the street screaming and shouting while drunk. The man in his 40s was wearing all black, and the man in his 30s was in a light gray tracksuit. Maybe 5 seconds after my mom sat down again, we heard a thud. My mom went out to the hall and saw the man in his 30s throwing himself against our front door. My mom, my granny, and I screamed and ran to the door. My granny and I held the door down while my mom called the police. I was shaking as I heard the man yelling, "Get out of the damn house!" while he tried to kick the door down. My mom got through to the police and told them what was happening. We could hear the man in his 40s trying to calm the younger man down. Eventually, they walked off. My mom ran upstairs to look out the small bathroom window and locate the 2 men. I ran upstairs as well and looked out my bedroom window. I saw the man who had been kicking our door come out of the house, along with the older man who had been trying to calm him down. They were both holding vodka bottles as they got into a black BMW. The car drove off, made a U-turn, and parked right outside our house. I ran downstairs and held the front door shut again. I saw the man in all black run into the shop next to our house, grab something, and then get back into the car. The police never came. What makes it scarier is that my mom has a brain tumor. If they had broken in and pushed her, she could have died. My granny had just had knee surgery. She could have been seriously injured or worse. I'm just relieved that earlier that morning I had fallen and skinned up my knees, so I didn't go out to the shop. If I had been walking back from the shop, I might have run straight into the man trying to kick down our door. It still terrifies me to imagine what might have happened if the front door had been left open. I'm glad we were inside when it happened, and I'm grateful I had credit on my phone so my mom could call the police.
The person who experienced this incident is my uncle. One day, while chatting with a friend, they realized something shocking. They had both experienced a similar, unsettling event years earlier. When my uncle was young, he worked as a shepherd, grazing sheep in the mountains near his village. His work required him to stay with the sheep from noon until morning, often spending nights out in the mountains. On one evening, my uncle fell asleep while herding the sheep. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, he woke up and saw a creature unlike anything he had ever seen before. It had the head of a goat, but the body of a human. The creature was unclothed, with hooves for feet. At first, my uncle thought he was hallucinating, but the creature didn't disappear. It walked upright like a human and stared directly at him. Alarmed, my uncle grabbed his shotgun and fired several shots at the goat-headed figure. After that, the creature walked away. Years later, when my uncle told this story to his friend was shocked. To my uncle's surprise, his friend revealed that he had also encountered the same kind of creature years ago. The friend recounted how, one morning close to sunrise, he too had fallen asleep while herding sheep in the same mountains. When he woke up, he saw a creature with a goat's head and a human body standing right beside him. However, unlike my uncle's encounter, this creature didn't come towards him. Instead, it spoke in a strange, inhuman language before walking away. Both my uncle and his friend agreed that what they had seen was real. They described the creature in identical detail, from its unsettling goat-like eyes that moved naturally to its eerie tongue and mouth. Both were certain it wasn't a hallucination or imagination. They had both witnessed the same disturbing figure. This happened 17 years ago, when I was 10 years old, living in the Philippines. My grandmother, Yolina, owned a farm and had a bunch of animals. I had 4 cousins at the time: Pablo, Teresita, Alejandro, and Josephine. Each of us had different chores on the farm. I took care of the chickens and cows in the barn, while they looked after the sheep, cows, and dogs. My grandmother harvested fruits and vegetables. The first strange event happened when Alejandro was 9 years old. One night, grandmother asked him to fetch some beets, so he went out around 9 p.m. and didn't return until an hour and a half later. When he came back empty-handed, grandmother asked him where the beets were, but Alejandro just looked at her, confused. "I don't know what you mean," he said. He told her he had only gone to the outdoor bathroom and returned. He never heard grandmother ask for beets. After using the bathroom, he stayed outside playing with our 2 dogs, Lovely and Jean. So, who was it that went out after hearing grandmother's request? The next incident happened to Teresita. It was around 7 p.m. when she went outside to feed the dogs. She came back 30 minutes later, but something was off. She didn't have the empty food container with her like she usually did. Grandmother noticed laughter coming from Teresita's room. She went to check and asked, "Why did you just come inside?" But Teresita looked confused.
"Grandmother, I haven't left my room since 6 p.m.
Grandmother thought she was lying and scolded her. So who had grandmother seen outside? Then it happened to Pablo. One day, he stayed in his room all day and never came out. Grandmother left food outside his door, and each time she checked, the plate was empty. She assumed he was inside and didn't worry. But at around 5 p.m., Pablo walked through the front door.
"Hello, I just got back from the field,"
he said, holding a bundle of wheat, carrots, and potatoes.
"It took me a while to gather these."
We all stared at him in shock. Grandmother rushed to his room, flung the door open. No one was there. So who had been eating all the food that day? After all this, Grandmother finally said, "We're moving." Soon after, we sold the house and left. Before we moved, we asked the neighbors if they knew anything about the house's history. They said,
Many people hanged themselves from the large tree that stood there before the house was built, and previous owners have reported seeing doppelgangers.
and that's when we realized what we had seen were not our real family members. They were doppelgangers. Hi, my name is Zoe. This story happened in the early 80s when I was about 5 years old. I had 4 friends who were, on average, 2 years older than me. I was always known as a risk taker and was open to challenges, no matter how dangerous, even as a kid. One day, I was playing with my friends and we decided to go to a nearby birch forest, just across the road from my house. It was said to be haunted, but we went there anyway. It was just before evening. The sky was gray, and as we reached the birch forest, the atmosphere felt heavier, almost suffocating. This place was known for having dead trees, and people usually avoided it. By the time all 5 of us stepped inside, the uneasy feeling grew stronger, but we kept going until we came across an abandoned truck among the trees. Right next to it, we found some old planks, sat down, and started telling each other scary stories. One of my friends, let's call her Anna, started talking about a mysterious lady in red, rumored to be a witch who lived just a few blocks away. The thing was, the witch was still alive, and no one really wanted to mess with her. At one point, while we were swapping ghost stories, a sudden gust of wind swept through, making everything feel even more creepy. Then, as I turned around, I saw a red shawl or dress floating in the air near one of the birch trees, and it was moving toward us. That's when we ran, all of us. Being the youngest, I struggled to keep up. My friends could be a little mean sometimes, always making me prove how tough I was. They had already taken off, leaving me behind, while I ran as fast as I could, heart pounding and short of breath. I looked back, there it was, a red dress, strangely clean and bright for a place like that, still coming toward me. I pushed myself, harder, lungs burning, and finally made it home, still convinced that the lady in red was following me. I never told my parents about what happened, but what could it have been? A floating red dress? A ghost? Something worse? I might have the answer. I haven't mentioned this yet, but there were always terrifying screams coming from a mansion near one of my friends' houses. Except it wasn't just a mansion, it was supposedly a mental asylum, surrounded by electric fences. It looked abandoned. Locals said the woman who screamed was Greek and a so-called mental patient, but I have my doubts. That mental asylum was weirdly close to regular houses, yet no one ever came or went. No cars, no visitors, every window was shut. Who knows, maybe that poor woman was being tortured by some psycho, and somehow that led us to seeing the lady in red. People whispered about black magic, drug-related murders, and maniacs hiding in the neighborhood. I just hope, whatever it was, that it wasn't real. And worst of all, I hope it never follows me again. Hi, my name is Chae, and this happened to me when I was roughly 7 years old. I was out walking with my mother and her friend as the sun was beginning to set. We had been walking for a while when we decided to start heading back home. The sun had completely vanished and it was dark. As we were walking on the sidewalk, I decided to go ahead of my mother and her friend. I don't really know why I did this. Maybe it was to feel a bit more independent. Soon after I walked away from them, I heard a door from one of the houses behind me swinging open and slamming into the side of the house. A man walked out and began walking down the sidewalk that I was on. I didn't think much of it, but after a while of him following me, my young mind began to create scenarios. Fear began to get the best of me, and I turned around to see the man still behind me. He had curly hair and a mustache, and wore a strange-looking sweater with old glasses. He saw me notice him, but continued to walk closer. I decided to turn left and cross the street to the other sidewalk. My heart sank when he did the same. When he got to the sidewalk I was on, he frantically looked around as if he were checking to see if someone was watching him. Then he continued after me. As he got closer and closer, I saw my mother walking on the sidewalk across the street, and I took my chance to run. I have never forgotten what happened after I ran to her. I turned to see the man staring at me from over his shoulder. His eyes were crazed, glaring at me with anger. Then he ran away, and I heard the same door slam shut. We went home, and I told my mom. I thought she didn't believe me, but later I found out that she did believe me and was trying not to scare me. Many years after that event, I went back to the house where the man had come from. I knocked on the door to be greeted by an old couple. I played it off as an accident and walked away. My friends and I have also reported seeing the man in an old, rusty, purple car. One day, after walking home from school, we went up to the car and looked through the window. The back seats had been ripped out. There were saws, hammers, and other tools lying in the back of the car. I don't think the intentions of that man were good. To this day, I occasionally wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run back to my mother, or if I hadn't kept walking. I would like to stay anonymous, but I would like people to know that I am a 15-year-old girl, and this took place in a medium-sized town in northeast Maryland. One day, I was driving home from my friend's house. My dad and I were on the road, late at night, and the only lights illuminating our path were our car's headlights and the street lights. I remember this night. It was a quiet one. We live in the suburbs, but not many people were out. So when we saw this thing, my dad and I were the only ones to witness it. As we approached a roundabout, we both saw something in the distance that we first presumed to be a bird, but at the same time, it was huge and had a human-like body, unlike anything my dad or I had ever seen before. As we got closer, it suddenly extended its wings and flew away. As we exited the roundabout and got closer to home, I turned to my dad and said, "Did you see that? Or am I just hallucinating?" He had fear in his eyes, completely shocked as we drove the rest of the way home. When we arrived, my dad and I told my brother what had happened, but he just laughed and shrugged it off. I had a hard time sleeping that night. I just couldn't stop thinking about it. About a year later, we discovered a YouTube channel featuring videos about supernatural creatures and theories. One video in particular got our attention, and as we watched, we realized something. We think we know exactly what we saw that night. The Mothman. There have been sightings all over the world, but none here. Why is it in our town? Why did it want us to see it? I'm still terrified thinking about it to this day, knowing that it may still be out there, lurking. From when I was about 8 years old, I can remember one night so clearly. My parents were leaving town for a wedding, and it was about 7 p.m. And mind you, I was going to be home all by myself. Before they left, they told me to lock the door and don't open it for anyone. And they said they would be back by 11 or 12. They told me to be asleep when they returned. I said bye to them, locked the door, and went back to playing with my toys in my room. Everything was going fine until I got this uneasy feeling, like someone was watching me. I shrugged it off, thinking it was nothing. Then 2 hours passed, and I wanted to cook something to entertain myself. I went to the kitchen and started grabbing things out of the refrigerator. Onions, cucumbers, tomatoes, etc. Then that feeling came back, but I shrugged it off again and didn't think about it. Mind you, I was a very brave kid, so that's why my parents left me by myself. I was starting to cut things and cook things, edible or not. Half an hour passed, and while I was cutting, I felt like I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, and then I saw a gray-looking creature with dark eyes, bald, tall, and creepy-looking. It did not look anything like a human at all. It saw me looking at it, and then it vanished. I was frozen completely. I didn't even move or shake. I was just blank. After a few minutes, I cleaned up and started looking around the house. I was 8, so I wasn't thinking too much about it or what it could be. I checked the time, and it was past 10. I put on my PJs, brushed my teeth, and prepared for bed. I fell asleep quickly. Then, a few hours passed, and I felt like someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and stood up. Then my shoulder felt like it weighed down, like something was pushing it down. I thought it was a reflex, but why would a reflex happen at this time? Then, as I looked at my doorway, I saw that creature again. We both looked at each other for a long 3 minutes. I was frozen again. Then I screamed as loud as I could, and I started to cry. By that time, my parents had already come home. My dad ran into my room and asked me what was wrong. I pointed at that thing, but he couldn't see it. And then it was gone, just like before. After that, it never appeared again. I hope it never comes back. I'm just so glad my parents were there to help me. But what if my parents had never come home? What would have happened to me?